Mom deserves the best, and there's no better place to shop for Mother's Day than Whole Foods Market. They're your destination for unbeatable savings, from premium gifts to show-stopping flowers and irresistible desserts. Start by saving 33% with Prime on all body care and candles. Then get a 15-stem bunch of tulips for just $9.99 each with Prime. Round out Mom's menu with festive rosé, irresistible berry chantilly cake, and more special treats. Come celebrate Mother's Day at Whole Foods Market.
So I thought it was a problem of mission. And then as time sort of rolled on and doors closed for me, I would name it now that the fundamental issue is white supremacy, whiteness with a side of patriarchy. And in white Eurocentered denominations, that is the beast, that is the power at play, and belonging for anyone who doesn't fit the white cisgendered male role or the ideal gaze, doesn't fit that gaze. You're going to have a tough time to belong unless you really, really assimilate. But even if you do go through all the hoops, you still will never make it.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast. This is Dr. Tom Rundell. And I just got done with a pretty mind-blowing conversation with Rohadi. And my brain kind of exploded a couple of times in this one. It was definitely a learning experience for me. I've been on the pathway of learning about racism and whiteness and white supremacy. And this conversation definitely just dove right in with a cannonball. So I guess trigger warning, if you have any kind of white fragility, you do not like conversations around racism, this is probably not the topic for you, although I would say maybe start dipping your toe in the water and start learning about how whiteness and white supremacy has shaped you and formed you. I've definitely been on the journey learning that, and it's been very uncomfortable, and it's really kind of shaken me up a little bit to deconstruct from how whiteness has formed my faith. And yeah, this is a great conversation. I hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, here is Rohadi. Well, welcome listeners to another episode of Liminal Living Podcast. And today I'm excited to have a very special guest joining us, author, entrepreneur, pastor, economist, podcast host, nonprofit leader, marketing consultant, Rohadi. He has recently published this book that caught my attention called When We Belong, Reclaiming Christianity on the Margins. And this was a really insightful book that's going to be guiding our conversation today as we delve into the liminal space of deconstruction. So, Rohadi, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
Now, this is my first time meeting you. I just read your book and I said, man, can we have a conversation? And you're like, heck yeah. So I'm really appreciative for you being responsive on that. Now, one of the things that caught my attention, you wrote in your book, if you're genuinely interested in someone, ask them, tell me about your people, then sit down and listen to the stories. And I'm already sitting, so I'm genuinely interested. Tell me about your people, sir.
Well, thanks again for inviting me here into your in-between space. Yeah, my people, that was my kind of joke, is say you have to buy the book in order to hear my story, because what's often, or what I grew up with, and that's maybe sort of changing now. If folks want to, particularly white folks, want to figure out your racially ambiguous self and whether or not you belong, they'll ask you, what are you? Or where are you from? And so I say in the book, don't ever ask those questions. Yeah. But if you're genuinely interested in someone by relationship, then invest the time to sit down and listen to or ask the question of who are your people. So yeah, my people are displaced people. My maternal side are Chinese and Japanese, and they came to Canada turn of the century, around the 1920s, I think, in between the wars. So they've been here a while and experienced all the different aspects of being Asian in rural Alberta, in British Columbia. My Japanese side, of course, they were interned during the Second World War. And so both were displaced from their lands. There's actually, in Canada, it's called the National Film Board. There's a documentary about my great-grandmother, my Japanese great-grandmother. They were looking to have, you know, the story through the book, but they were looking to do a centennial documentary about her life. And when this is in the family, as they were planning this documentary, it turns out great-grandma had a massive secret. Uh-oh. And the movie trails out. It actually stops, and it's like, we can't actually do this documentary of what we wanted because the story has shifted to a secret family she had before she came to Canada. And she was displaced, my great-grandmother, from Japan after an earthquake and for other reasons. My dad's side, my dad and I are from Trinidad, West Indies, in the Caribbean, the last Caribbean island just off the coast of Venezuela. Our people are displaced from India, and effectively, we could call it state-sanctioned human trafficking, labor trafficking. Back in the day, they were displaced from India by the British government and put into the Caribbean, lured into the Caribbean to work, to replace the workforce after the abolishment of slavery. And so my dad's side were from Trinidad, the West Indian side. Most of them are still there. But then displacement again, we immigrated to Canada. So I've been in Calgary for almost my whole life. And this is home in Calgary on Treaty 7 territory. This is a particular treaty land. That's how we name them. And not all lands are treaty lands, but that's how we name in Canada to acknowledge the traditional Indigenous nations that have always been on this land. So that's a little bit about my people.
Gosh, there's a lot of liminal space of not quite being at home in there. What? Yeah. Like, what made the decision to then immigrate to Canada? Or what?
Yeah, that's because my mom's side's here.
Okay.
And so my mom's from Calgary. Grandpa and grandma not from Calgary, but settled in Calgary. And then my parents met for school in Montreal. So this became the landing spot. Obviously, my dad wanted to leave Trinidad for whichever reasons. So like you said, it's liminal in that there are a lot of different intersections of why I am here. And the stories of my people behind me who shape and form who I am. Only now am I really thinking about the stories, their stories of I've used the word displacement and how that factors into my own body for the sake of embodiment, and how it shapes and forms who I am today. So I haven't always been alert to that. And I also mentioned in my book how many white folks they don't even know who their people are. Mm-hmm. Couldn't name it. They're just sort of, I'm white. I don't even know who or where they're from. We've always been here. Yeah. Of course you haven't, and so I think everyone has to do some work of figuring out who are your people.
Yeah, I think that is, our people is what shapes us and where we come from. Do you have like this early memory that you could recall that's kind of shaped your mind and heart into who you are today? Is there any kind of a, from these roots?
No, I don't think so. And especially if you're a new immigrant, then I've been here for almost 40 years, but there is a pressure to assimilate. And so you actually give up a piece of yourself and a piece of your people in order to fit in, and to varying levels and degrees, of course. So there is a giving up of your story that many people lose in assimilation. And that's not just for people of color. White folks, I think there's a demand to assimilate into whiteness, and you lose your identity and your people in that process. It demands, whiteness does. It demands you give up your identity to assume this cultural identity of who you ought to be, or what at least the standard you ought to be pursuing. And so I think a lot of folks, especially if you want to survive, and new immigrants, that's a key piece, that you draw towards the allure of assimilation in order to do so. So
yeah,
that's that requires intentional work to come back to. So I will only say I'm recently coming back into learning more about my own people. Not everyone's like that. They're very cognizant of where they come from. But others have given it up and need to do some work to come back.
Yeah. What are the benefits that you've found, like going back and doing this research and finding your people, your family, your roots? Like what did you learn about yourself, and how's that being expressed?
Yeah, I think, and this is a good question, because I think everyone needs to do this type of work. Maybe you have some weird folks in your history. Maybe you are a descendant of slaveholders. Maybe you have to contend with that reality. I think a lot of my own story is epigenetics is a word that describes embodied trauma, literally in the genes.
Yeah.
And so it makes a lot of sense when you think of racialized trauma, of what my body, I'm doing a lot of embodiment work right now, what my body has absorbed from my ancestors. And when I look at each family tree, it is trauma upon trauma upon trauma. And I have used this word, and I don't know if I've used this word as much as I have in this podcast already, but displacement, part of which we may talk about, of decolonizing your faith or decolonizing anything, I think requires land-based teaching, land-based theology, to be connected into the stories of the land that you're situated on. But I have been, and my people have been displaced upon displaced upon displaced from land. So that's a piece of identity that you lose. And you need to figure out, you can't reclaim it. Like I can't reclaim that loss. But what I can do is try to figure out what it would mean to heal from those losses. So in many ways, in very real and tangible ways, I am in that liminal place of displaced from my indigenous lands and coming into somebody else's indigenous lands in order to find a space of belonging. We all got to do that work, I think.
Yeah, I never thought to connect trauma with epigenetics until you were mentioning this. But that concept of your genes, some of them are static, the color of your hair and eyes and all that kind of stuff. But then there's so many more of your genes that are switched on and off by just your environment and your diet. And I never thought, you just made my brain
And you don't
explode.
think of it. And then when you do, you go, oh, maybe that's why such and such and such. Maybe that, like, oh, geez, that really explains like what I'm feeling right now. Or I can't think of an example of where I connected dots. I think internment is one of them for my Japanese side. And it's just like, whoo, like there's at least a generational trauma that has gone down the line from my grandfather, who was a child as he was interned, and then that trauma into my mom, and then going all the way down the line. And you slowly see pieces of that stop as you become alert and aware, as when you can name the source and what those traumas are, you can become the the breaker of those cycles. And so that's sort of the space. All that is wrapped around embodiment, which is a very distinct and important and crucial aspect of the Christian faith, right?
Yeah. I mean, one of our central tenets is the incarnation.
That must be, yes.
Now, what kind of, we just talked about the faith here, so what are your faith roots going to look like, as a kid growing up? What kind of Christian home did you find, if any?
Yeah, half of us. My dad never did the church. Well, he did. I shouldn't say that. He initially, as we came into Calgary, my aunt came to faith, evangelicals found her somewhere.
Sorry about that.
And then we did. And then we actually started in a evangelical church because the closest one was a charismatic church, like speaking in tongues charismatic. I didn't realize it was weird. I was just a kid. But that was the old it wasn't old. It was the portable white steeple church down the road. But they were fundamentalists, and so my dad came as well, but that was when he came up against like literal 7-day creationists, the speaking in tongues. It's just like all the wild things that you could think of, and how that would turn off the majority of people. So he's never been back. He might show up to a big church if I'm preaching. And then my mom and I and my sister, eventually, we would have been shaped and formed predominantly in an white evangelical tradition is what I would call it now. Usually the only people of color in the congregation. So that was the shaping and forming of me. I even went to an evangelical seminary later on. But then once I exited seminary, that was the end of the evangelical journey. And processing at the time, 20 years ago, of how does someone like me belong? And evangelicals in Canada are very much the same as evangelicals, believe the same as the US. In fact, most of the formation for Canadian evangelicals comes from the US. So we think, believe, read, listen to the same things. There's just less or fewer evangelicals here. Maybe 8% of the of the population, something like that. It's very small. And so there's less clout, less prominence culturally. But we believe in our enclaves the same stuff. So that's my formation growing up. And then 20 years past that, since it's been, I wouldn't say that I'm deconstructing or working my way out of any of that anymore. I've done that. Now it's more a process of figuring out what does life-giving faith look like for someone like me, but for a modern world. And that's sort of my space now.
What was that first domino that got knocked over that caused you to kind of question all that white evangelical culture?
Yeah. And so it wasn't whiteness or race to begin with, although I would now say that is bedrock. That is the foundation of what ain't right. And like, to date your podcast, today the SBC booted Saddleback because of women in the church, right? So that's gender. The SBC is a denomination that is rooted in slaveholder religion. Like, we want to keep slaves, so we created our own denomination. Seriously? That's the DNA.
I know. And I just learned that like last year.
Yeah. And so I don't know how much has changed in the DNA. Not much. So the point being, I never named white supremacy, slaveholder religion. I mean, this is Canada. We pretend racism doesn't exist here. That's an American problem. And so in a predominantly white churches, I always noted that we were incompetent, as most evangelical, any church really, incompetent at connecting with people who don't look like it, or who don't look like the congregation, earn the same, vote the same, live in the same place, and certainly the same race or ethnicity. There's just a lot of sameness in churches. And so being more entrepreneurial, I set off to be a church planter and to diagnose those problems in the church. So initially I thought that these were foundational problems of mission. If we just fix the theology or the thinking, maybe it would influence practice and we would do better at welcoming people who don't look like us, which was really probably something going on in the back of my mind of how do I belong as this racially ambiguous, non-white leader? Like, how can I belong in my gifts, which are in the evangelical mold, the lead pastor, CEO kind of guy, the preacher, pastor kind of, but the apostolic figure. Where could I belong outside of an ethnic congregation, of which I don't fit into any ethnic congregation? And the answer is nowhere. There's no way I'm going to be able to factor in or find a place unless I'm the token. So I thought it was a problem of mission. And then as time sort of rolled on and doors closed for me, I would name it now that the fundamental issue is white supremacy, whiteness with a side of patriarchy. And in white Eurocentered denominations, that is the beast, that is the power at play, and belonging for anyone who doesn't fit the white cisgendered male role or the ideal gaze, doesn't fit that gaze, you're going to have a tough time to belong unless you really, really assimilate. But even if you do go through all the hoops, you still will never make it. So the pieces were falling apart as I named, listen, even evangelical churches who try to do evangelism do so poorly. How can we be better at sharing this good news, right? And then it switched to, well, actually, our incompetence isn't about theology. It's fundamentally, we don't have a praxis within most contemporary churches of how to operate with an expansive table with all sorts of people who don't look like us, who can come together and we can, in a reciprocal way, so this is a relationship, be shaped and formed together onto a new path together towards Jesus. And so there's not a lot of churches, definitely not denominations, that are embodying that keyword in practice. So that's kind of, again, that sounds good in theory. Now putting it into practice, that's really tough. So that's where I would situate kind of my faith journey, especially as a leader. I guess that takes you to where I am now.
And you wrote this book that it sounds like it's just coming out of like your own story of wandering in liminal spaces looking for a place to belong. And
yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
I think so.
And then you're trying to help other people go on that journey that you're also on of finding places to belong.
That was actually one of the criticisms early of the book. It was too memoir-y. And so, I switched it, but it really is my own story of how, and I still can't. That's probably why I church plant, is because there is no place for me outside of the ones I create, which is tough. That's sad in many ways. But then I realized it's not just me. And I expanded my book from purely a racialized lens to say, wait a minute, folks in liminal places who realize that they do not belong into the traditions that they grew up in, they're asking the same questions. Is there a possibility that there is a faith for them in the place that they are at in a modern world, with the questions that they are seeking, in the bodies that they are in? Can they belong? And so I switched that and say, can you belong somewhere at least? Maybe you're not even there. You just, can you belong? And I outline a pathways, but the possibilities of absolutely you can. In fact, the Christian faith is rooted in a movement led by marginalized folks. When Jesus himself is marginalized, he's not part of empire. He doesn't have power and privilege, although at the same time he does. And so I believe in, this is what When We Belong does, that we can reform our faith in such a manner that actually centers marginalized folks, to say that the faith is about those on the margins first. Last shall be first, not first shall be first. And so from there, there's some learning, unlearning, resting in the liminal space of I don't know, the now but not yet, but having that core piece, or even perhaps that gift, knowing that even in your uncertainty, here is the picture of a faith that fits your body, that is asking the same questions of why can't you belong? Well, actually you can. It just may not be in the unsafe spaces or churches that you're in.
Yeah.
So that's the diagnosis. And then I also some solutions or pathways to start reframing what a more life-giving faith looks like.
Oh, I think you accomplished that really well in the book, just giving that safe space for folks. You wrote, deconstruction is a pathway that may liberate us from all that seeks to make us less whole. And like so many people think I'm deconstructing because I just don't believe in this theology anymore or that theology anymore. But you're making like this beautiful, simple definition that gets to the heart of what's going on. Like we are just tired of pushing ourselves into boxes that we don't fit inside of. Like how have you experienced this demand for conformity and compliance, and like what parts of your soul and body rejected it? And how did you recognize the rejections happening? That you're like, no, I can't do this.
I mean, for me, I would name very simply as being a person of color, I don't fit the white, able-bodied male gaze, and so I will never belong in my own skin in contemporary churches. We don't call them white churches; we just call them churches, right? Unless it's an ethnic congregation, then we say the Chinese church, the Korean church. That was it. So my story, however, is not everyone's story, because as a man, the effects of purity culture didn't really hit me. And I wasn't in a big church. So it did, because there are some ethics of sexuality that are malformed for men. Absolutely. But in a patriarchal world, I benefit from that. So I don't know that intersection, but many folks do. Queer folks, there are intersections there of trying to figure out where are the safe spaces for you. So I think we have to diagnose the malformed foundations, the bedrock problems in our traditions. And it's not just race, although I do name it as white supremacy. But white supremacy influences all aspects, all the institutions or systems of our world, from economics or capitalism, from disability or able-bodied ableism, to even beauty. And what are the standards that we ought to live up to in order to belong? And I think there's a dismantling of all of that thinking. And how do you, of course, get away from these aspects, these systems in our world, when it is the water in which we swim in? It's not in the water, it is the water. So how do we, I don't know if we ever arrive to a place where we've solved all this, but as we become alert, and so I use the terms of alertness and naming, naming malformed formation in our Christian faith, that drags all of those downright evil pieces into the light. And when we can see them, we can give it name, and we can at least know what to avoid, but we can also find a pathway to a better way. So not only healing, but also how we ought to live in order to be more inclusive, in order to live out a deeper ethic of last shall be first. All of this surrounding this embodied characteristic of being more like Jesus. So arguably, there are many congregations, Christians, who don't look like Jesus, right? And so I'm offering a pathway, but asking the reader to go through the hard things of naming those intersections, and some will be more pronounced for you, that are bringing you harm to your person.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for most folks, although I posted this as a tweet, and there was an interesting trend, I think most folks start to deconstruct because harm was brought to them. Something struck you and you decided that ain't right. Like, maybe you couldn't name it, but something inside of you is like, no, like that doesn't feel right.
Mm-hmm.
Spiritual abuse, heaven forbid sexual abuse, any form of abuse, patriarchy, racism. Something ain't right. Everyone now is hardcore Republican, and I know that was a case for many American colleagues, and 2016, how that shifted fundamentally their faith. Rise of Christian nationalism. Something ain't right. Now, when I posted that tweet, I noticed a trend where only some people dissented, said, no, that didn't happen to me, but they were all white men.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is an indictment to say, well, maybe it's because the contemporary church as a whole is built to match the gaze of white men. So it's not a matter of whether or not harm came to you. The system's not supposed to bring harm to white men, but there were other aspects that catalyzed that. Well, it was a theological idea that they didn't agree with anymore. It didn't necessarily bring harm to them, but there was something incongruent. Could have been science related, evolution. Could have been. So sometimes it's not harm, but I think, and I'm writing predominantly to those who realize that something ain't right, and you're wondering if you got to give it all up now. And I'm saying, not so fast. If you got to go, you got to go, sure. But there is a better way.
In your section naming the powers, like, it was just so helpful to track how, like, deconstruction is not merely about like an individual belief system, but like questioning the water that we're all swimming in, like the modern expression of those powers, capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, sexism, classism, militarism, ageism, ableism, racism, all straight quote from that chapter. You say they're all built on the bedrock of white supremacy. And then you have this definition: white supremacy is the primary tangible system of domination that we need liberation from. And I think, like, you're helping us see that white supremacy is not merely like that neo-Nazi fish over there, like with the swastika on them. Like, it's the water that all the fish are swimming in, and that was a really helpful section.
Yeah. And, full disclaimer, for white readers, if you've never done any work around anti-racism, diversity, white supremacy, then this book will be a shock. There's probably some pre-work there to do.
Probably.
Some other books to just dip your toe into before you hit mine. Because I don't, pull any punches, but I also make an assumption that you're in a certain place. So for white folks who haven't thought of it, I'm not saying, and I differentiate this, because so much of our culture is rooted in an individualized everything, but an individualized understanding of racism. That's intentional. We think of the one bad apple, the one racist. We don't think of racism as a system. So I'm not talking about white supremacists. Now, that's easy. We can all spot that.
Yeah.
I'm talking about white supremacy, the cultural bedrock that has shaped and formed all of our systems. And it is the process of either dismantling those systems or decolonizing out of them that can point to a better way. But in reality, we are in a space that is effectively exclusively, especially for all of our institutions and systems, rooted in the bedrock of white supremacy, of white superiority. And of the other end of that spectrum means anti-blackness or anti-indigeneity. which is more so in Canada. So that's the spectrum. That's what we're operating with, and it operates best when it is unseen.
Mm-hmm.
And for most of us, we operate in a culture where it is unseen, and we just go about our business. But for folks like me, or when you become alert and aware of how these systems play out, you can't help but feel the impact on your body.
Mm.
And so if you have more folks who, and this can go across any intersection, it doesn't have to be just folks of color. And, you know, if you have relationships with them, to listen to their stories, but it can be across the others that you mentioned, sexism or patriarchy, which is massive in the church. COVID has brought up the magnitude in which ableism is prevalent in the vast majority of our churches. We are not built for disabled bodies, even though we will all become disabled in some manner in our lifetimes. We just don't accept that because, again, culturally, we want to be enveloped by the certainty that whiteness offers. And if you don't assimilate to that, it's hard to find belonging.
Yeah.
But it's out there. It's out there.
Yeah, and like the whiteness you talk about in your book is so covert because it is the water that we're in.
Yeah.
And you know, I've been attempting, as you said, to do the work. I wasn't shocked by your book because I've been a couple of years into this, like just slowly waking up to like, oh my gosh, like I remember the first time I admitted it to somebody. I was at I was visiting a church in the area. It was a mega church, and we're in a rural area here that my little church is in. I'm a pastor here, and I thought I'd stop and say hi to the pastor. Turns out it was an inner city church that bought land in the rural section so they can have a big building. Yeah. So I walk in, and I'm like the only white guy in this rural mega church. I wasn't expecting that, and I sit down and talk with the pastor. We had a great conversation, and he's walking me through his church and showing me. And we get on the topic of racism, and he's like real, like tiptoeing, like, is this okay that we go here? And I finally like admitted, I think I've been thinking about it a long time, but I admitted, I says, I've always been comfortable with people of color, black people, growing up near Detroit, as long as they acted white, I would be okay with that. But if they acted with their culture and their music and their values, it made me uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And that was like my problem. And I had to like look at that and be like, this is whiteness here, because the rest of society is like this too. It's built on this expectation that the white way is the best way, and everyone has to assimilate to that. And I guess I've been waking up the last few years to see how damaging that is to the entire world.
We have to process in what manner or what are the things that has produced that way of thinking, because it's not just one thinking, one input. How is it that you and your body, something, you feel when different cultures, or black culture, which is not a monolith, of course, but that there was something confrontational in your body that you felt. So what were the systems that shaped and formed you and your body to be in that place, to just sort of default to that ain't right, like that this is wrong, like what's up with that music, oh that's violent, or so think of the education, think of all the media, mainstream media, think of even local or state or federal ordinances, legislations, all sorts of things that have all contributed into producing a particular way of thinking. And it's just not, you are not just one dude who woke up one day and you're like, no, gonna have racist thoughts today. It's actually, we are all products of this system of white superiority, of whiteness. And man, if haven't come to a place where you can name that. And for you to name what is happening in your own body, to be like, what is that? That is a crucial step into what I think is a lifelong journey. You never arrive into both naming, but unlearning, and then learning towards a more inclusive way of being, and for us to be together on the land. So yeah, it's no book's going to help. Oh, sorry, no book's going to solve it.
Yeah,
but some books can help. and yeah, to come to that realization for yourself, that's good. Okay, so what's next?
Yeah. Have you found that like making a distinction between like a racist individual versus the systemic racism, does that help when having conversations and then encountering like the white fragility, to have them take a closer look and say, oh, you're not talking about necessarily just me, you're talking about the water that I'm in?
Yeah, and it's important to make that distinction, because one of the worst things you could call a white person, and this is again a social construction, one of the worst things you could call them is a racist. Which is ironic, but white people don't want to be the racist, because racism is bad. We all get that. We totally all get that. And that's why we have reduced racism to the individual actor. The one dude who sprays a swastika on a synagogue, the one dude who bombs a black church. Right? It's always a white dude, it seems like. But that doesn't mean that we can characterize or create a caricature of who is the racist. Yeah, there's the white supremacists, the white nationalists, which are same to me. These are dudes that are overtly, it's like the Klan, right? I think we would all agree that the Klan, not all, is bad. But what we're saying, and we ought to differentiate it, is no, it's the way that we have been shaped and formed, even in our Christianity, even in the songs that we sing and the theology that we have, to understand that white is better, and white thought in particular within the church is better. We don't name it as such, but it would explain the exclusivity of so many of us being discipled, being read by, only hearing sermons by white men. So there is a shaping that, if it's not nefarious, at least it is woefully inadequate. There's so much of the world out there, and you're telling me all of your Christianity is stuck within just a little piece of an experience within a community that is dominated by sameness. Don't think that serves us very well. And I don't know if it gets us closer to the marginalized Jesus, which is a big piece. So for Christians, I appeal, of course, to the teachings of Jesus, who is a marginalized person, an ethnic minority. He was under Roman occupation, in the process of being colonized. Are any of those things you? That's not. And so many of us, especially on the intersection of wealth, are so far away from what the early Christian looked like, that I wonder how we even absorb the teachings. And you can read more in many of the liberation theologians on that subject. Yeah. But yeah, it's a space where it's important. I don't do a ton of this work because I think white people should get their own people.
Yeah, as is our
But
job.
it's important to start raising the alertness, the awareness around systemic intersections of whiteness. Because I'm not calling white people racist. I'm not, like, it's not a bad thing to be white. I think it's incomplete because white is not a thing. Find your people. You know, remember we started with that. What is your ethnicity? Are you Scandinavian? Are your folks from Britain? Is it Scottish? Is it Irish? Like, find your people. That is part of your, I think, a deeper form of identity, even though ethnicity in many respects is we create that as well. But it's not, at least on the continuum of white and black, which is intentionally built white in opposition to black, rooted in anti-blackness. So that's what race produces.
I love that emphasis on find your people, even for like white folks, because the genetic tests are big, you find your homelands and all that, and ancestries are big and all that, and you find your ancestors. I think that, we gave all up our land and we came over here and took the land from the indigenous people here and colonized it. And then we lost contact with our roots and ancestors. And I wonder, how much of today's political shit show is based on the fact that we don't know our roots, so we'd rather just identify as, in this conspiracy theory Trumpist camp, or if we could get to our roots and find our people, maybe we could depolarize ourselves.
Well, you have certainly named the core aspect of what is so appealing of white nationalism, or whatever they call it, Christian nationalism, so forth. There is a threat to white superiority. And if your identity is rooted in you being white, it is under threat. No doubt, because so many people are demanding for equity. So what are you trying to preserve in this whole Christian nationalist, white nationalist, whatever you want to call it? That to me is white supremacy. What are you trying to preserve? What are you so afraid of losing? And fear being the operative word. And would having a deeper understanding of your own personhood and your own people help? Unquestionably, because white is not a thing. Whiteness is just something that we need to buy into in order to take part in the powers and privileges of white. And even I, as a brown, racially ambiguous Asian, I can participate in that to a degree because I'm not black. So I can be the model minority and be white to an extent and have some of the riches of whiteness. This is how the system is at play. And if you don't know anything beyond just white, then right now it seems like threat, like loss, and you need to fight to preserve power and privilege. I don't think in our society we've really been developed in the West to have a sense of equity for all. Of course, I say this, and then there's lots of folks that do have that ethic, which is good, and many Christians, all Christians should, but we're kind of every man for themselves. We are ruled by wealth accumulation and capitalism. So there's just so many things working against us. But you named it. White as identity is one rooted in white superiority or anti-blackness. And if we don't have anything else to tether ourselves, then it seems right now that fragile state is about to blow away. And why not be violent about its preservation?
Gosh, it must be, you up in Canada, you get a little bit of the polarity that's going on down here between conservative and liberal, Republican, Democrat. And it's like,
it's here.
I've seen a little bit of it.
Emboldened by Trump. Trump merely released what was already operating under the surface, and it had the same effect globally. But in Canada, absolutely. We just elected. I live in the most conservative province, and we just had an election of which the winning Conservatives, which they always win, they won, and the leader has been a liar. Looks up to DeSantis as an example. Anti-science, anti-vax. What was the other intersection and all of that? So all of the pieces of white nationalism, although not named as such, they're here. So thanks. But it's not like you exported it. It was always here.
It was always there. So it's not that you're just living above a meth apartment or something.
Yeah, the meth lab.
The meth lab down there.
I mean, the one thing we don't have, so culturally, definitely, the white folks who are afraid of the shift, they are pulling hook, line, and sinker to this new sort of fringe right-wing politics that the Republican Party has popularized. And what's happening here, like woke, that was the other one.
The woke,
just the anti-woke crowd, like, man, like that's so racist, you don't even know. We have a made in Canada version of all these things. And so we're no different.
I get you. Sorry about that. Now,
guns. That was
it.
Yes. We don't have gun violence in the way you do, but everything else is pretty much similar.
Now, I think like one of the distinctions that like that conservative camp wants to hold to is like this like rugged individualism, and you wrote about that. And one of the quotes you said, the notion that we belong everywhere so long as we discover our quote unquote authentic self is incomplete. If we were to measure belonging in terms of health, it's not in the self where we find whole health, but rather within relationships found in abundant community. Now, as one who swims in like the waters of the contemplative stream of the faith, you know, we can often romanticize that individual interior life, which I think is important, you know, finding the true self. And, you know, I think valuing that is good, but what you're showing us and teaching us is that to exercise that true self, it's vital to have overall health and safe spaces with where you don't have to just assimilate into and conform to like that true self. So would you see this as like we need that true self, and then we need the safe space to operate the true self?
Again, there's no monolith to this, and maybe there are contemplatives, or maybe there are desert fathers or mothers who can live by themselves. But what I was critiquing was what is kind of popularized. Brené Brown is supremely popular, many good things, but a lot of the work, and it's not just her, is rooted in finding your authentic self, the self. And you do, yes, you do need to belong to yourself so radically. But I fall short to the notion, and maybe it's because I don't get it, because there have been great thinkers, Maya Angelou being one, who have spoken to the manner to belong to self is the pathway to belong anywhere. So maybe I just struggle with that concept, but I also read it through a colonial lens, in that if you think you belong everywhere, that's kind of presumptuous, because have you even been invited to belong to the land? And by whom? Or do you just think that you can belong anywhere because you just showed up? And so I opted for a more holistic, whole as in comprehensive understanding of belonging, saying absolutely do the work of belonging to the self, and all the healing that you need to do in order to come into your whole self. But the safe community, crucial, a life-giving community that is on path for the liberation of all folks. That is like, where is that community? And if you can find it, of those reciprocal relationships that are breathing life into all folks, but into you and you into others, that is of such value. It is a gift. But I also add on top of community the notion of belonging to land. And so I didn't flesh that out because it's not fully my expertise, but there is a notion of that if you belong somewhere, your feet touch the land. And in what manner have you been invited to belong, or how do you belong to that land as well? Thinking of the land as being very much alive, of having memory, of being formative to our both existence and identity. So there are other factors, I think, into comprehensive or whole belonging that go merely beyond individual work.
I like how you expand that to include the land as well. I think that's important.
There's a faith to that there too.
Yeah.
Of course, of belonging with God. And so that was the fourth piece. Okay. Don't forget the God part.
Now, I think that this concept of deconstruction, like you still encapsulate the people who feel like they don't belong. You said churches create a finely tuned orchestration of belonging. Assimilation to dominant ways of being and thinking are an expectation. Deconstruction happens when our bodies and souls can no longer endure destructive messages and incongruent beliefs. For many, receiving blows to our convictions and personhood accumulates to the point that only one healthy choice remains: leave. I'm tired of giving up a piece of myself just to fit in. I think you just captured the sentiment of so many walking the road of deconstruction. Like, I guess, why would the church rather maintain institutions of conformity instead of cultivating communities of belonging?
Oh, it's all about power. Yeah, that's an easy one, is power and power preservation, because institutions only know how to preserve themselves. Like an institution, by its definition, is how can we change the least to preserve what power we have? And Christianity on top of that is how do we maintain Christian supremacy? And so anything that comes to attack the inherited power of an institution, of a denomination, of a church, of its leaders, all of those things will be met with skepticism, because we're not built like the early church, which is in fact a deconstructing, and then wasn't named as such, but it was a movement out of Judaism, right? This was a new type of movement that suddenly had rapid and massively wide inclusivity. Gentiles, can you imagine? Women, can you imagine? It was radically inclusive, and that was one of its keys to its expansion, to its success, because it embodied the teachings of Jesus. And I don't want to say that no church understands this, but it is so rare to have a church that is so well equipped to adopt the posture of last shall be first. But not only we serve well, last shall be first is about reciprocal relationship. So it's not that you welcome the stranger, but it's how the community then was also changed by the stranger, so that that a new way forward was embraced, where all could go forward together. Not just that one person, the stranger, came in and assimilated to what and that's how most churches work. They assimilate to what the dominant culture is there in order to belong. We don't have practices, understandings, know-how to figure out what would it mean to collectively be changed by the new voices that are coming into our communities. Now, that's a lot of work, but I don't even know if we have competencies around making something like that happen. And so, like, deconstruction, if you want to use that word, and I'm fine with it, people are leaving, and if you got to go and never come back, I get it. But, like, why are these institutions just grasping at straws, as for many of them, the only thing keeping them afloat are all the endowments that they have or the land that they have banked? It's not because there's a rash of people filling the pews. They're actually emptying, and COVID is not spearheading, it is increasing the rate of exodus. So, yeah, power. That was a very long-winded answer to power. It's power preservation, always.
I love how you said, we're bringing in the outsider, but not to conform them, but so that they can help shape us. That's a big piece. Like, I grew up in the white evangelical culture where you go on mission trips and you go to these other cultures, and you're pretty much bringing them whiteness. Like, here's the white way to do things. Here's let me fix you because you can't figure this out. And like that whole concept of, let's remain cognizant of the fact that we're, just because, we're the ones with the white skin in the church and the Bible's coming into these places, like, we need to be shaped by the people that we're trying to quote unquote save and reach. And that whole Christian supremacy and white supremacy, it doesn't leave enough room to shape the people of who are white, who are doing these mission endeavors and church endeavors and all that. And I just love how you included that in there, so thank you.
Yeah, what you named it, white is right. And when you're shaped and formed in that water, boy, I can't see many white congregations acquiescing or coming together in relationship with, say, an Asian or brown or black congregation to come up with. So it's like multi-ethnic churches, right? Let's say you want to create one and you're going to be shaped and formed into something new, but multi-ethnic churches are really hard because it's usually white folks who wind up leading them, or they leave because white folks and Christians are really not used to being discipled by or being led by people of color. And so that's race.
Yeah.
So those are the different intersections in our culture. It's like, oh, I don't know if we have this reciprocal humility and generosity for one another to pave a more life-giving path.
Yeah.
That kind of sounded defeatist and hopeless. And in some ways, like it is. Like some ways it is. And so where are those life-giving communities, man?
Yeah.
And that is a search, and it is a risk every time you try to find a new community. Is that you got to put yourself out there again, and it may come back to blow up in your face.
Yeah, I noticed that my shaping came from white men. When someone asked me to put together one of the, Facebook, hey, what's the top 10 books that shaped you? And I wrote them down, and then all of a sudden I looked at them and I was like, there's no women. And then I looked at them again. I'm like, there's no one here of color. These are all white guys.
Yeah.
And I then said, I need different voices. And I turned to Howard Thurman, and I turned to James Cone, and I turned to Maya Angelou, and I started to say, I'm going to need some different people to speak into me, because I've hit the limit of what my faith can do for me, and what can shape me into, because it's so white dominant. And I read the Black church in America history, and I'm like, they're the ones that preserved what this faith was about in this country, when the white folks were the ones who would have their church service, then they go and do their lynching, and then they come and have their potluck. And it's like, and then you look at the spirituality that survives in the Black church in America, in the South and parts of the North, and you're like, they're the ones. You read Howard Thurman, and you're like, they preserved this thing for us. They have something life-giving. I need to learn from these voices.
Yes, and I name the sources of plausible places of a decolonized form of Christianity, and some of the Black churches and the Indigenous church, Black institutional church in America is one. Of course, that doesn't mean that there aren't intersections or critiques. Patriarchy is still widespread and a big problem. Not a lot of queer affirming Black churches. So there are pieces there, and then there's still challenges. But how many white folks really know about the history of the Black church in America, and how it emerged out of as a reaction to not belonging, of having to not being allowed to go to white churches, or you go and you sit in the segregated section as a slave. And so a resistance movement emerges, and it bears fruit, that which is the Black institutional church today. I don't have much connection to their being Canadian, other than to say I echo so much learning of the pathway to resistance and liberation through that tradition.
You said that racism is endemic, systemic, and systematic. And then you kind of included these 4 pillars of white supremacy, of commodification, extermination, demonization, and indoctrination. Can you talk a little bit about like what that looks like, maybe your encounters with these, to like help me understand these categories a little bit better?
Yeah, the reason why I did systemic, systematic, and endemic was just to say that it's everywhere. It's the water that's endemic. Like there's just really no space unless I go to, well, not even. I was going to say go to my family when my family's gathering together, but not even, because whiteness has hit us. Like we still have been shaped in anti-Blackness. So there's not too many spaces. It's endemic. Systematic, it's by design. It can hit us in specific ways, and then systemic being the institution, the way it operates within systems, which is very biblical, by the way, when we talk about systemic problems. And I use Walter Wink as my dialogue partner on this to speak of how the way that Jesus or the New Testament writers would have described world, so cosmos, the world, do not conform to the world, Romans 12. It's a word that means system. Do not conform to the world. Do not conform to the improper or the malformed systems operating in Asia Minor in first century Rome. But put your body on the line as resistance. Put your body on the line. That's your spiritual act of worship.
Wow.
Systems we know.
That's great. I love that interpretation. Put your body on the line. I've never heard it that way.
Yeah, and that's not mine. That's I heard it from Drew Hart, who is a Black theologian. I don't know where he got it from, but that's it says present your bodies as a living sacrifice, right? It says put your body on the line versus what? Is it do not conform to the world? Well, don't conform to those systems of oppression, and the way you do that is that you stand in front of them by putting your body on the line, and then that is in some spiritual act of worship or pleasing to God. The other 4 pillars that you had mentioned, I would direct readers to Dr. Shaniqua Walker Barnes, womanist theologian. These are the voices of my people. Those 4 pillars come from her. And they describe in detail the manner in which racism operates and commodifies. Well, it all has to do with bodies. So commodifies bodies, past, present, future, or past, present. So that's where I would go for those.
It kind of feels like everything's blowing up right now. You look at the state of the church, the state of the political temperature and climate, the state of the actual globe.
Yeah.
How do you envision the future of faith and spirituality? Do you see a shift happening in the way people engage these topics? And and what do you believe that shift could look like, or what are you seeing?
Yeah, it's a good question. My which was my first, but it wound up being my second book, Thrive, was an analysis of why the church sucks at trying to change and how we might do better at ushering in new ideas. And it still is not very good. And I don't think it will change because it's the institutions, and institutions don't change. But it also, I think, is relevant to the pandemic world, because in the pandemic world, we're seeing an acceleration of exodus. And I posited back then, using data, that virtually every single denomination, including evangelicals who long suggested that, oh, no, we're resilient. Oh, we're actually, incrementally growing. Turns out that's not true. That's what I said. It's not true. And today, what denomination is growing? If that growth is not coming from immigration or births or transferring existing Christians, there's no denomination growing. Disclaimer, maybe there's 1 or 2, but most of them who are showing feigned growth are doing so through immigration, already churched, already Christians. So I don't think the hope is in denominations, but I don't write them off. If that's your home, then whatever, that's fine. I'm not going to put in the effort in order to shift. The other shift, I think, is how many churches and leaders are leaving over becoming affirming same-gendered marriage, same-sex marriage. So there's an exodus there as well. But virtually no white denomination is doing well with the pandemic, and certainly not doing well around intersections of race. So where does that leave us? Not to write off denominations. Maybe there are good things, sure, happening. I think things get smaller. I think we're definitely seeing every ensuing generation, which, by the way, started with the boomers, not with Gen X or millennials, but every ensuing generation is going to church less and less and less. Gen Z is going to come through, and In America, the fastest growing religious segment is no religion.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time, I think it's 2030, I can't remember my data, half of all Americans will just check the box no religion. Canada's basically there. And denominations will, with big land banks, that are able to cannibalize themselves, so sell off their properties to survive, they'll stick around. They can lose 90% of their members. They'll stick around. But my sense is it's in ways that we've never thought of before, by leaders we wouldn't acknowledge as proper leaders. And I would value, and it would make sense if it was pockets of small. So smaller communities, localized, hopefully, but doesn't have to be. Pandemic has shown me, this is my learning, that online community has power and counts. So I don't know, there's folks doing gatherings that I would call church, that high church folks would not call church, and I don't care. Like, why would anyone care what institutions have to say if they're just trying to live community, love well, as Jesus did in a group of 12? And I think the only people who have a problem with that are pastors or church leaders who have been shaped and formed to think 12 is too small, or it needs to be in a building or something like that, or it needs to meet every Sunday, or all of that, I think, should collapse. Or rather, I'm going to say it shouldn't collapse. It's like you saying, I only read a bunch of white guys. That's not evil. That's not bad. It's just, again, woefully incomplete. So let's expand our imagination for, I think, the ideas or the communities that are already operating. They just are not within the radar of any church. And if we had the choice and the funds, why not try to support them? So that's my sense.
Yeah, I like what Seth Godin says, that, find your tribe and make it as small as is sustainable. I think
there are pros and cons
to
that of small, but that's just my sense, and I'm biased because I've always operated in a small environment.
Yeah. So as you well know, the liminal space of faith deconstruction can be challenging and disorienting. So are there any specific spiritual practices that have been helpful to you personally during the process, and that you could recommend to others who are going through some kind of liminal space of dark night or deconstruction? What's buoyed you up and helped you along?
Yeah, and I never named it as deconstruction. That term was never something we popularized. So my journey is not really similar to what the contemporary modern kind of deconstruction reality is right now. But I will say that my book outlines it, a pathway. Big part is naming what ain't right. You got to put a name to the things that are malformed, that have hit you, because then you can start to either unlearn them or heal from them. So I think there is an important component of therapy, counseling, therapy, of trying to unlearn purity culture, to unlearn abuse, or to heal from those things. So that, especially those who have faced harm, that's part of it. That's part of it. And that's got to be okay. And unfortunately, that in many respects is not accessible. Therapy, for example. But there are a lot of tools now on social media to at least help become alert. And here's the second one. And this is more of this can be looped into a spiritual practice of somatic healing, which is a fancy word to talk about how do I practices that I can embody, that my body can do to heal my body. And for me, especially as a man, I need to become more alert to what is happening in my body and how I've been shaped and formed by culture and the church to act or be a certain way, and whether or not that is life-giving or damaging. So, for example, becoming more in tune, and you wouldn't think of this as deconstruction, but becoming more in tune with emotions. Emotions I get, rage and anger. which is like most dudes, like we get those, and then all the rest, it's like I can't put a name to it. And so there is some work in unlearning cultural artifacts of what it means to be a man. So there's that component. Land-based theology, I think, is important to deconstruction. White supremacy and unlearning that is also important because we need to know what we're dismantling or working our way out of so we don't replicate it. Yeah. And so those aren't the read your Bible every day, pray for 15 minutes, quiet time. It's none of those. In fact, I would say the opposite. If you've been raised and shaped and formed in those traditions, know that it is okay to drop them. And it's even okay to never come back to them. And there needs to be a permission, I think, for folks who are coming out of harmful spaces and religious trauma to be like, okay, like I can give that all up and it's okay. It's okay because your freedom is on the other side of whatever that new thing is. And what my book does is if I say, if you got to go, you got to go, because I'm not going to tell anybody what you have to do. But I want to say, is there a possibility that the Christian faith can exist in some other form or tradition or white formation? Is there not a possibility that Jesus is somewhere in the mix there? And if there is, then spend the rest of the time following Jesus and hopefully finding a few faithful and forgiving friends along the way to journey with you. And that might be it. And that would be enough.
I love that. I love the permission and the freedom that's there. And I can't think of a better way to close out this podcast with those words. So thank you for your wisdom.
That was the benediction.
That was the benediction. We have been benedicted. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I got so much to think and process, and I'll be doing that when I do some editing on this thing. So it's been awesome. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for letting me yammer.
Any day. All right, here I am still sitting outside processing that conversation right here outside of my office in Lanesburg. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it helped you. I hope it was uncomfortable to kind of get you to really think about some things that need to be thought about, need to be challenged. And it was definitely that for me. I was nervous going in, and Rohadi really helped me see, understand, and was very hospitable, and I appreciated his presence and our conversation. I learned a ton. He's a wise man, and I will be checking things out. If you want to follow him on his socials, Twitter and Instagram, look him up. They'll be in the show notes. Also buy his book. It is a really wonderfully awkwardly uncomfortable book to read if you are of the white bent, and yeah, it's needed. You need to read it. It's amazing. And check him out on his podcast. That'll also be in the show notes, but Faith in a Fresh Vibe. He has regular stuff that he talks about there. It's pretty amazing. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next week for the Liminal Living podcast, and that'll be episode number 11. Peace out.
Mom deserves the best, and there's no better place to shop for Mother's Day than Whole Foods Market. They're your destination for unbeatable savings, from premium gifts to show-stopping flowers and irresistible desserts. Start by saving 33% with Prime on all body care and candles. Then get a 15-stem bunch of tulips for just $9.99 each with Prime. Round out Mom's menu with festive rosé, irresistible berry chantilly cake, and more special treats. Come celebrate Mother's Day at Whole Foods Market.